All right, VK and Patrick, if I could ask you to unmute your mics, I'll say a few words of welcome. We'll open up the Zoom, and I'll pass it to Pascal in just a second. Hello. Alrighty, bonjour and bienvenue tout le monde. On behalf of Fourth Space, welcome to Research and Conversation in the Faculty of Arts and Science. We are streaming live from Concordia University's Fourth Space, which is located on unceded indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke. Nous reconnaissons la nation Kanien'kehá:ka comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. And we make this acknowledgement to bring awareness and understanding of the history of indigenous peoples and their territories, and as a call to rethink one's own relationship with the city, the land, and environment. At Fourth Space, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we collaborate with our university community to connect people to the diverse initiatives, research projects, and dialogues that are in development across the university. So to that end, we are thrilled to have the opportunity to work with Patrick Leroux and Rebecca Ackman, who made these conversations possible, as well as, of course, all of the researchers who have been invited to share their work with us throughout this week. It's now my great pleasure to welcome Dean of Arts and Science, Pascal Sicotte, to officially launch this series. Over to you, Pascal.
Anna, thank you so much, and thank you to the whole team at Fourth Space. I'm pleased to be here today, this afternoon, to kick off this Research and Conversation series that will take place all this week here at Fourth Space. Merci de vous joindre à nous, en personne et en ligne. Throughout the various sessions, you will be treated to rich exchanges with researchers from the humanities, the social sciences, and the natural and health sciences. You'll discover the many ways in which these researchers' work inform, influence, inspire, and allow each other to produce new knowledge, reflect on the challenges that we face as a society and as humans, and inspire and implement change. Ce travail et ces échanges sont tout à fait représentatifs, à mon avis, de la contribution que notre faculté d'arts et sciences peut faire. Cette interconnectivité, this interconnectedness, is at the heart of what many of our scholars do. We have research strengths in the critical areas affecting our society and our world. Key examples include, of course, health and well-being, aging, sustainability and climate change, and social justice. These areas require that we work across disciplines to question, and to find new solutions. Through the events this week, you'll be led on a path of discovery. This path will allow you to capture the depth and the scope of all that is done in the FAS. Et votre guide pour cette aventure est Patrick Leroux, vice-doyen à la recherche à la FAS. I couldn't think of a better guide to lead you through these exchanges than Patrick Leroux, our faculty's Associate Dean of Research. But it's also important that Patrick, as a researcher himself, shows the hallmark of this interconnectedness that I was speaking about earlier. His research touches literature, theater, arts management, contemporary circus, and research creation processes. He has regularly taught at the National Circus School and is founding director of the Montreal Working Group on Circus Research. He is the author of numerous academic titles, the most recent being Esti toasté des deux bords, les formes populaires de l'oralité chez Victor Lévy-Beaulieu. Perhaps my accent was not entirely appropriate here, with Sophie Dubois. His work is thus very, very much interdisciplinarity in action. In addition to his role as ADR, he is professor in the Department of English as well as in the Département d'études françaises. He is a member and current secretary of the College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists of the Royal Society of Canada. And he serves on the Council of the Royal Society of Canada and on its International Committee. Please join me in welcome Patrick, the lead for this week. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So thank you, Pascal, for first of all for allowing this to happen, because I'm doing this on my Associate Dean of Research time. So thanks for allowing me to come engage in conversation with our researchers. Also, thank you to the Fourth Space, resolute, adaptable, enthusiastic partners in all things pertaining to research. Really appreciate this. And Rebecca Ackman, of course, from the ADR office, who has really crafted this series of talks and helped me plow through so many books and articles. Because just to give you a context, we'll be in conversation with 17 researchers. So 12 interviews over the next 4 days this week. So this is, at least 12, actually 17 universes, 17 approaches to research, 17 positionalities as well. And I have it's really a pleasure to start with VK Preston. I'll give a bit of a biographical presentation, and then we can dive in. So VK in the 90s was a student here at Concordia when this was a bookstore, when the Fourth Space was a bookstore, and the windows were all blocked with bookshelves. After Concordia, so it was a BA in Liberal Arts. VK did an MA in Comparative Literature at SUNY Binghamton, PhD at Stanford, visiting assistant professor at Brown, postdoctoral fellow at McGill, then assistant professor at University of Toronto, and VK has been with us since 2020, so August 2020, in the heart of the pandemic. So I think we saw each other once in person since the pandemic, but we're in this mode of rediscovery. Yes, we have bodies. Yes, we have legs. And this notion of bodies will obviously be part of what we'll be discussing today. So interestingly, VK, you are a professor in history with an interest and an emphasis on material and oral histories. You trained in performance studies, but also with a focus on dance, and we'll come back to that as well. And you've worked across histories of the performing arts, essentially, looking at the cultural practices of embodiment and stigma and injury as well. So there's something, I think, fundamentally experiential and interdisciplinary in your own parcours. And I'll be very curious to ask you a number of questions over the course of the next 40 minutes. But maybe just to start, how are you finding diving into this new environment to be for you? Like, you've arrived during the pandemic, you've changed universities a number of times over the past few years. You've found your footing here at Concordia. How's it going, and what gets you up in the morning and you think, yeah, I need to do this?
That's neat. Well, one part of that trajectory was training as a performer.
Right.
And I did have an injury, and that has raised a whole bunch of questions about how we understand practices. Is it the case that if somebody, shoots out their knee, that they're no longer part of practices and so on? I think that these are like meaningful and substantive questions around something like disability studies, something maybe like injury studies. How do we better understand the contributions of the forms we're making? And that has taken me into history. I mean, I'd say this is a really important moment in the history of the performing arts. I think that you would share that, in that we, in many ways have measured time in the performing arts around periods of closure of theaters, closure of performance spaces and so on. We've just lived this one at a global scale. The performing arts are among the most profoundly hit sectors at all levels in the trajectory of young artists who train into closed theaters, in imagining new possibilities and going outside. Suddenly weird performance forms in the medieval period that were outside make a ton more sense, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that in my case, beginning to look at publics
Mhm.
as being critical has been helpful. So I'm teaching in public history here and
Right.
took the students to powwow on Friday. So trying to really integrate that all these cultural histories and practices are fundamental to the way, you know, our societies are intersecting.
So what did you look at? What did you observe? What did you analyze at the powwow, for instance? You see, you brought your students there. So what are you looking for? What are you looking at? And how does this fit into the, I guess, performance studies, but also historical and historiographic context you're working in?
Well, the historiographic context for them is looking at things like dance bands, right?
Mhm,
So,
mhm.
I mean, between the Indian Act and we're going to look next at the Massey Commission, these foundational documents for a number of our cultural institutions, including libraries, archives, theaters, arts councils. There are really problematic statements in all of these about race, about sort of a hierarchy of the arts. I mean, the Massey Commission literally talks about a white man's civilization and so forth. And so part of what I want the students to be doing is to build their awareness, especially if they're going to work in cultural institutions, on the kind of founding documents that affect the institutions that they're stepping into. And another part is to participate. You know, I don't think that I want students ideally to be going to powwow with a scholar's lens on, not at all.
Yeah.
It's very much about realizing this was the first one for this institution, going through a certain kind of procedure that the university is inviting and participating in that, being moved,
Mhm.
you know, participating, being moved for sure. Students were saying they were deeply moved by large parts of the powwow. That's the part that I want us to experience together. And, you know, having been at multiple institutions, some with long-standing ones, I think Stanford's is now 52 years in, others more recent, that, you know, one student was critical and said, you know, is this reconciliation and so forth? Of course, those are big charged questions, but I want them to have a familiarity with Thanksgiving addresses, with when is something sacred, when is it social,
Mhm.
and to participate through their studies and all of that. So I thought it was great.
Yeah, so,
My own work does go back through the long colonization.
well, I was thinking of that. Yeah, so you told your students, never mind the clipboards, come and experience, feel, and discuss. And you pointed to something interesting in that, well, there's a few things, right? On the one hand, beforehand you talked about the closure of theaters that we've just experienced and experienced for the first time, well, since the Spanish flu, and we've all forgotten that, of course. It was over 100 years ago. There is a record of the theaters closing during Shakespeare's era, closing, opening up, closing, and it's like a cat and mouse game, right? For a number of years, for actually over a decade. And you've also alluded to certain performances being banned outright, not being allowed to be performed. And so do you feel that your students, I guess, and yourself, having an acute awareness, historical awareness of what has gone on, but also engaging what is happening now, do you think this is like a fundamental part of the discourse, of the dialogue that you can basically establish?
That's what I'm trying. We'll see. It's such a, we're speaking in the second to third week of term.
Mm-hmm.
But I think yes, and I think this attention to publics at a moment when we're so conscious of ourselves as bodies in those publics, of our breath, of entering into spaces, of it being stressful to be in a room full of people for the first time. All of these things are things that I'm hoping that they can attend to when we start to think sometimes in more historical and theoretical terms, also in embodied terms, about what it means to be publics, and also what it means to have been publics through this mass scale of mediation that we've just lived through.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it speaks to them. And then I also think that there's a sense of an insufficiency of past histories of performance, a critique of the category of performance itself, which I take very seriously in my work. But they're critical of the whiteness of fields. They're critical of that kind of disciplinary narrowness sometimes, and part of what I hope that we support is that actually when you delve in, there's all sorts of other stuff that hasn't been central to the records. And so, even in the sort of most paradigmatic of those things, like ballet history, my work is showing Black Atlantic connections, long histories of slavery, citation and Jesuit relations, that these are not formations that are only in particular metropoles, but they're formations that are part of the whole way in which we've begun to think of public events and cultural practices, invent even the category of the artist itself. And there's a lot of ideological baggage that therefore comes with it,
Right.
that as they get to know maybe an edgier history, that also allows them to understand some of the seams that allow them to be more critical practitioners and also historians. I think there's
I'm absolutely fascinated on how you bridge this historical record and day-to-day experiences and cultural manifestations, basically. I was looking at some of your earlier articles, the interdisciplines between dance and theater in early modern archives, where you look at sexuality and magic in Baroque dance records. I found that absolutely fascinating. You also translated the Théâtre de Neptune, Marc Lescarbot inaugural foundational theater dialogue for a certain understanding of Western theater in Canada, certainly. And you've written about that as well. So you're looking at the archive, but you're also looking at the body in the archive, or representations of the body in the archive. How exactly does one do that? And is there a part of, do you surmise to a certain extent, or what do you see and how do you explain this?
That's a good point, and I think that definitely ran up against COVID in particular ways, and I think it was this cross-section of having a performing artist training with managing to get in the door of some of these collections with the scholar training, and it sometimes felt like a little bit of academic drag because I have the language skills and I have the sort of close reading skills and visual analysis skills, but they come from a somewhat indirect pathway, right? Like I learned French primarily through my dance training, and then I did the professional conservatory here in French and struggled through. But that meant that for me, reading texts that had to do with these performances, I wasn't necessarily reading them as ancient verse. I was reading them as potentially really wild ways into strange performative events, and some of them go all night. So part of the first thought was, okay, nobody stays up all night if it's really boring. The reconstructions seem kind of boring. When I start to look at what the drawings and so forth are, there's a huge amount of drag. There's a lot of political satire. There are definitely explicit sexual references. There's a lot of complex thinking around race that's coming up with a whole wave of scholarship. And so I think just approaching it as I would approach performance and engagement with things, that particular one that you mentioned, the How Do I Touch This Text essay, I was working in the archive at the Paris Opera, but I could hear rehearsal. And so, it's a sense of these are documents in use, you'll have conductors come in and go through scores while you're working. The one that sort of follows in the book project, when I was working on those, the librarians were protesting. So you had librarians going through the archive, banging on pots and pans kind of deal. And then when I was doing the work around Indigenous figures in these early works, alongside actually, representations of enslavement in Africa and in Turkey, that work was happening in a building that was adjacent to the Louvre's relatively new African and Americas collections, which include Taino work and so forth. So there was a real sense of there's a weight to encountering material like this, because it's absolutely happening in the moments that this city is founded, right? In the
Right.
moments that the colonial inheritance we're contesting is being shaped, and it's not only being shaped in text, it's being shaped in all of these circulations of practices, in their records, and the ways in which that's being represented. And in some ways, some of those are the most explosive issues that we might have sometimes today. So part of it is just to trace long roots of that and say,
Right.
okay, this has a huge political impact. You know, if I'm looking at a text from 1619 and there's all sorts of discussion online about the 1619 project, it's not to disaggregate cultural forms from the struggles we have about history, but to understand cultural forms is absolutely integral to those. And if I'm seeing images of dancers and histories of enslavement in performances from that period, it's to also know that that's recognizable when somebody's in an audience, right? It's not absent from cultural discourse. And in fact, there's evidence to a protest going on there. And I think it activates who publics are, but it also activates histories of complicity, histories of appropriation, and so forth. So it's been an eye-opener. I didn't necessarily expect it. It was very much that I started working with the material and was like, this isn't supposed to be here. And the more you trace things that aren't supposed to be there, the more a more flexible political approach to the histories of culture and interculture emerge.
This is absolutely fascinating, and you're looking at mostly through the lens of dance, but touching upon other performative aspects as well.
I mean, like that dance and theater
Yeah.
example, like dance and music are fairly inseparable. Dance and theater are fairly inseparable in many forms. Like, you know, they have institutionally separate contexts sometimes. Some of this is being dismantled, some of it isn't. They have different training sometimes. But once you get outside of a particular cultural sphere, you know, those formations are going to be problematic, right?
In what sense? How are they problematic? And for whom?
Some texts are, like, let's even say something really mainstream, like a Broadway musical with a dance tradition, right? Are we going to put it in the theater bucket? Or are we going to put it in the dance bucket?
Yeah.
If it's a tradition, I was just listening to CBC in August, and there was a case where an indigenous song had been appropriated into a Louis Riel opera, and it was an interview with the people in reimagining what that piece of music might be, right? That's traversing completely different ontologies and epistemologies of song and of sound and of what it means to have a long history of a country that's collected these recordings and so forth and deployed them in ways that have an epistemological violence. So having the sense of the long histories is great, but seeing that the touching of histories is sometimes at the real, you know, arterial contact of the deepest cultural violences we experience, I think.
You evoked Louis Riel opera. There's a number of plays also that have been produced, and we won't go there, but I recall the courtroom drama version where you never knew which side would win. And so speaking of appropriation and recalibration and using art for, in this case, this was a production in Ottawa, political appeasement, I'd say. So I'm curious to hear you speak about this notion of, let me rephrase that. What histories do bodies carry, and how do you as a researcher access that, interpret, and present this to us?
That's a good question.
So you've talked about the archive, you've talked about farther, I guess, audience perspectives and some critical reception. But if we come closer in time, how do we do this, and how do you do this specifically?
Well, the one I do most specifically is the history of techniques and practices, right? So in a class context, for example, I'll try to get students to talk about the practices they do. Like it may be that somebody's a chef, or somebody last year was a competitive horseback archer.
Wow.
I know, it was a great
It's a
project.
thing, yeah.
Because I think you kind of have to be a practitioner to access those. Another student was a photographer. And so to find ways in which they start to activate the way they see, the way they move, the way they understand, the way they touch,
Yeah.
as ways of knowing, and then invite them into taking longer views of that. How might they find another source? So the photography student looked at some optics treaties and made a camera, is it camera lucida or camera obscura?
Obscura, yeah.
And so, on the one hand, it's a dive into past knowledges. On the other hand, it's a dive into your own sensorial archives of how you learn to see, how you learn to compose images. He did it with his bedroom, so I guess it was particularly
Okay.
one's own space. That was in lockdown during COVID. Same with the horseback rider, looking at histories of the saddle, movement that's possible in the saddle, but also the ways in which particular indigenous fiber practices are being used with the lariats that go in lasso making and so on. So that's one way in that most things we do have practices that extend over long periods of time. They extend, obviously we'll have new practices, but we also, they're built on foundations of old ones, and often the techniques have complexity within them. So some of the ones that I look at as a researcher may have a codification. They'll say these are the good ways and these are the bad ways. And then they'll be like, but don't do the bad ways the way everybody does it all night when they're out having fun.
Right.
I think we can safely assume that the bad ways are practices, in a really popular sense. So finding ways against the grain to sometimes read things not as they wish to be presented, but as possible scripts for doing them, as people might in everyday life sometimes, but also as things that people pass on within families, things that people pass on within institutions, and the ways, coming back to questions like injury, the ways that some of those parameters around what can be practiced and what cannot be practiced have disciplinary consequence, psychological consequence, traumatic consequence. A lot of performers are hurt through their training, certainly in circus, certainly in dance, certainly in theater, certainly in music. And so trying to, on one hand, think about, yes, we're training many kinds of forms, but that training has also come at a certain cost. And thinking about that as a cultural inheritance, as something that can't be dismissed in the institutions.
And contested, as we've seen during the pandemic.
Exactly.
In theater conservatories, dance conservatories, and theater school, there was a bit of a soulèvement, Me Too movement, really
Absolutely.
pertaining to training practices. But paradoxically, we've also seen the highest number of injuries in decades as we return post-pandemic, because the bodies were not training during that time, or not properly training. So this brings us back to the idea of technique. Understanding technique, criticizing technique, sure, certainly questioning some of the pedagogical strategies associated with performing art technique. You mentioned that maybe the interesting part of hearing your students and hearing artists talk about technique was when they were basically going into bad technique, right? Transgressing essentially the dogma, but especially the practice. So you worked on ballet, which is entirely practice-based and very convention-bound and unreasonable. Like, we are not meant to be up on on point. As a father, seeing my daughters do that, I'd think, "Oh God, what are you doing?" But every discipline, artistic discipline, has its quirks, but also its expectations. Would you say that the injuries you've been looking at art tend to be injuries because of technical faux pas, because of artists not necessarily adhering to their discipline-specific training or technical innovations, or is there something else at stake? Like, what have you been seeing and hearing?
That's a good question. I mean, I think in some ways this is research I'm getting into more than the research that I've been doing.
I'm anticipating.
Yeah. So some of it is the concern about things that have been extracted and sort of omitted within ways we understand forms, and I see that as injury too. And so part of it is getting much more pluralistic about understanding who's practicing. Another part is paying attention to the ways in which people were never practicing forms in those extremely distilled ways exclusively. And so finding the complexity within what's happening. I mean, without giving too much away from some of the sources, there's one that says, these are the 10 of something, the good and the bad, but we only know 5 of them. So all of the bad ones have been removed from the history altogether.
Wait, the bad what, exactly?
The positions of the feet.
Oh, the positions of the feet.
So these kinds of understandings cross over with disability studies, cross over with, so they're quite fundamental kind of cuts through how we understand the ways practices are happening.
And then you had Edward Locke with La 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 Human Steps.
Right, and he,
doing all those bad positions, right? and imposing them to a certain point on certain dancers, some of whom are injured.
Yeah. I remember seeing some of that work and also being struck by the staging of injury in it. So seeing somebody like Louise Le Cavalier doing these amazing barrel rolls and then hitting the ground and taking a while to get back up, and then they'd hit the drums and she'd do it again. And so there was a kind of anticipation of us being moving in sympathy with the harm as well. Right. And I know that when I came to one of your circus events and I watched, because I had been in, very serious ballet young, including the sort of boarding school worlds of these and the national level, and seeing young people going face first towards the ground it really upset me. And I wasn't expecting it. And I think it came from coming through disciplines that have a lot of young people injured really early and not a lot of roots for seeing them through into their futures. But also, maybe there are ways to work with more kinds of bodies with much more sophisticated understandings of what a body can do.
Right, and this is definitely happening in contemporary forms, less so in classical ballet, less so in classical contemporary circus, acrobatic circus, but certainly in theater and a lot of the hybrid forms. I'd like to come back to this notion of injury that you evoked, and maybe tie it into the body's histories. Are injuries, basically, injuries writ large, it could also be professional exhaustion, we'll take that into account. Could those be basically sites of historical investigation? And if so, how can we tease from those certain meaning in an artist's trajectory, but also in our, coming back to audiences, in our perception of what they're doing? Because the form sets up expectations.
Those are really good questions. I mean, I think, it's incredibly intersectional as a set of questions, right? There can also be moral injuries, there can be workplace questions, labor questions. But I think there's also the way in which it's a place of innovation. That's obviously a word I'm really critical on, certainly. But
it's a buzzword.
Let's think about Alexander or any number of these practices. So many of the ways in which people approach techniques in fresh ways come from working.
I'll just take a pause because I'm conscious that not everyone in the audience would know what Alexander is. What do you mean by technique? Just a few moments on that.
So some of the ways, writ large, people call these somatic practices, but some of the ways in which new techniques are born are that they are the slow, patient, thoughtful, embodied way people have worked through their own injuries. And so I think that it can be quite an emancipatory kind of question, historically and otherwise, because certainly there is that sense of the termination, but there's also, you know, the vivre avec, the living with that comes, that generates new forms and new practices, some of which have had huge impacts on other communities who learn them. So Alexander technique comes from somebody who lost their voice, I believe an actor, who's sort of developed these ways of moving that then move in through all sorts of training for performing artists, for musicians, for people learning to sort of reconstitute their bodies in the times that they need to. And for me, that's a politically interesting and maybe quite hopeful way of approaching the present.
Right. And so the coming back, sorry, I asked for you to detail what the Alexander technique was, but you were headed towards a discussion of the injury as a site for history, investigation, sense making, and also positioning an artist in their trajectory, but also our own appreciation of them. Is this something you actively do? Are you conscious of this, or is this just one of many ways in?
No, I mean, I think for me, should this work emerge in the way that I'm hoping that it will, it would be its sort of philosophical content in some sense, that maybe there's been a gap given how much work we do on technique. Maybe those techniques shadows in their injuries are the more profound place through which to do the history and the thinking and the reimagining.
Because there's something very sensitive, very delicate when you talk to an artist about injury, because it shows, you know, how vulnerable they are. It also positions them as potentially out of the loop, right? I don't recall if you were there. It would have been about 10 years ago, in the early days of the circus research working group, and we had a talk on it wasn't injury, but it was pain, and it was the most sensitive topic ever, and I hadn't realized to what extent this might be so intimate, right? This was something that the artists were basically, they were all aware of it, but no one explicitly described it. No one spoke of the pain they were constantly in to achieve their level of technicity. Working on these histories, do you touch that? Do you have a sense of that? I guess with the archival work you wouldn't necessarily, unless you've got you know, for first-person narratives, but with some of the more recent work, is this something that comes up, or is it still pretty much under the surface?
It's really complicated. I'm working through it. So with the historical work, I have these kind of amazing images of wheelchairs on stage in the 17th century, bodies that are dismembered, bodies, which again is not what we really think of as the inheritance of a medium like ballet. And then what it's really doing is staging false healing, and that's a political scene. So, you know, within my work on this, I'm thinking about these ways in which false healing gets deployed as a whole set of desires, as well as political kind of channeling of a moment directly during and in the wake of civil wars, and I find that quite powerful as a set of images. But it's also being used to talk about, you know, chasing injured soldiers out of the cities, right? So it's a problematic, troubling legacy. And then thinking in more recent terms, I mean, I'm doing some caretaking, giving in my own life, that just the deep relationality and the hope for one's own practices, for others' bodies, lives. You know, I think these are extremely sensitive. I don't think there are any artists, if we're speaking specifically of artists, I don't think that's the only set of people we might take up. But I don't think there are any artists who aren't constantly working through technique and injury at the same time, and questions of pain and how one measures living and being in the world accordingly, right? The practices of getting out of bed, the practices of keeping bodies in motion. And for me, I think that's actually quite extraordinary. It's not to talk about this as a kind of foreclosure of people's practices, but an appreciation of the depth of the work that they're doing. So.
Speaking of pain, you're working on a monograph, your first monograph.
Yep.
How is that? I remember you mentioned in a sort of offhand conversation that your recent work was bringing you to rethink of a lot of the material, but especially on how you would present it. And I found that fascinating and terrifying, obviously, but also extremely sensitive to the movement of thought that's actually occurring right now. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, part of it is that this is the dissertation project. I, for a while, worked on something else, and I came back to it. And part of it is that I picked sensitive issues in the dissertation, and all of them have grown into fields. So part of it is also that these, things that people weren't really talking about, they're talking about now.
Right.
So, that has been one challenge, is marshaling such complex material. Another is, as somebody who works primarily sort of narrating and investigating, the touch of the archive, the scent of the archive, being allergic to the archive, which happened, then suddenly working with PDFs was not happening for me at all. But I also think that the structures through which people encounter histories, let's say in the performing arts, are complicated. They're not necessarily university-oriented ways of engaging with history.
Right.
So the intersection with public history, I think, is quite on point there. And so part of it is, I don't dismiss the power of the tools of doing that robust historiography, and having it be inflected by the ways of knowing that come from the arts. But I'm really curious about what forms, given the kind of amazing material that I've been looking at, what forms might make that accessible within artist and young artist training contexts. They might approach, they probably won't read the peer-reviewed version. But given how amazing the drawings are, like we were just looking at them really briefly, and some of this could be manga. Like, it's really stunning and really strange, and invites, I think, a creative way in. And so I think some of the ways that we approach material, especially, somebody once said you should do a children's book with some of the materials so that you're actually getting the dancers on that early part of their lives where they're learning the genealogy of a form, because you're essentially saying this genealogy is a political construct, and there are more genealogies. And so the queerness, the dual bodies that have a male half and a female half, the disability figuration and so on, are there ways to make access to this kind of image that has in some ways really just not been visible, although the explosion of digitization is shifting that very quickly. Another change to the archive. Yeah. Maybe through video and through other sort of video article, video essay formats, becoming way more accessible to folks who pretty much when they see it, love it and think it's super cool. But before seeing it, I think it's in this paradoxical place where you don't think it could possibly exist. And so by talking about it, you're just sort of stirring a bit of mystery. And then, that there is a legacy to consider tends to be quite accessible when you look at drawings, for example.
Right. Well, you certainly stirred up my interests in reading this monograph. No pressure. I know I know it will come out, perhaps in a multi-volume form, including manga type publication. Maybe as we conclude, I'd be curious to hear you about interfaculty collaboration. You're situated in history, but I hear you're also working with Ray Mansbach, for instance, who I'll be speaking to very shortly. Can you talk about like how these collaborations come about and what you're doing, but also like how does one do this, right? Not everyone is compelled to reach out and to work with someone in physics, for instance, if they're in history. Like how does this happen?
Honestly, friendship. I don't
Friendship.
know. I think it's meeting people that you connect with and having a sense of an expanded stakes of ways in. So Ray and I met during the online faculty onboarding, which is a whole universe.
Excellent, yeah.
Yeah. And got in touch, and then I think that these questions around, how do we know our knowledges, how do we practice them, how do we envision them as being relevant for lives that we care about in different ways. So I'll leave to Ray the brilliance of the project.
Sure. Yeah. Well, we're talking to her next, so so there'll be a segue. Yeah.
But in that case, I'm sometimes based in Montpellier, France, in the summers with a program, and so had access to really large archives of medical representations from the longest running medical school in Europe. And we're talking about sort of brain injury and the effect of COVID on cognition. And so I happened, also it's close in my life, I happened to go to the exhibition and saw these like just mind-blowing kinds of ways of representing brains, including this massive mesh sculpture that had a kind of keyboard, and it's no longer working, but it could light up parts of the brain for lectures. And so we were in the beginnings of this conversation, and I was sort of looking at, at some level, like what performs most, right? All these ideas of the mind and the brain and of cognition, the ways in which it's represented, the ways in which there are kind of lightning leaps in how we understand the representation of brains and neurons, but that they're also communicated. And so in that way, I mean, they have long histories. We're facing a moment where many people are experiencing cognitive symptoms,
Right.
and the question of measuring them is deeply challenged, and even to the point of, we're in this moment of struggling about knowledge itself, how that knowledge is communicated. And so it made a lot of sense to be in a conversation about if people have concerns about what is real knowledge, how do we approach that in another way?
I can't imagine a better sentence to conclude. What is real knowledge? How can we look at it in another way? Thank you, VK, for bringing us into your research world. I feel like we've only scratched the surface, but you've introduced us to your world. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm excited to hear from Ray.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So we're just going to put a pause on the live stream here now as we set up Patrick's next